Hi, everybody. The purpose of this slideshow is to give you a really quick reminder about imperialism, and to go over kind of it from the European perspective and how it kind of impacted Europe and why it happened and stuff like that. To be honest, most of the imperialism part of this is actually done in ninth grade, and I know that y'all's ninth grade was not perfectly done because of COVID and stuff along those lines. So I'm hoping you got a decent amount of it. But if you read the parts in the book 745 to 753, and you listen to this, you should be in pretty good shape. Remember that when we talk about imperialism, we're also talking about forms of neo-colonialism in Latin America and the banana republics and stuff like that we already talked about. So some of this we've already covered when we were talking about 19th century Latin America and stuff like that. Okay, so here's essentially what I'm going to be arguing to you guys today, which is that basically what I've said before, which is that industrialism plus nationalism equals imperialism, and that due to mass production output, population growth, societal revolutions, etc., the main countries, the primate countries of Europe, so the big five, which is kind of turning into a big six with Italy or the Ottoman Empire or something along those lines, but England, France, Austria, Hungary, Prussia, or Germany, sorry, at this point. England, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia, along with parts of the Ottoman Empire, at time to time, Spain, though its empire is kind of breaking up, other places in Europe like that, the primate countries in Europe, right, began to see themselves as superior to other world civilizations. A large part of this was caused by the rapid expanse, the fact that they had technologically kind of jumped a huge hurdle from being non-industrialized to industrialized, and the nationalism that went with it, and the national racism and racial nationalism, and stuff like that we talked about in Germany, but wasn't unique just to Germany. Occurred in tons and tons of other countries too, right? And so they start to see themselves superior, and then they also have to deal with this whole balance of power issue, right? And the interest in maintaining the balance of power on the continent becomes really important in establishing world empires and stuff like that. As you guys know, the Congress, or sorry, the Berlin Conference and Scramble for Africa was divided up so that no one country got to be too powerful or anything like that, and they even included places like Belgium in it, right, in order to keep the balance of power for stuff like that. So you can think of it as balance of power, you can think of it as wanting to keep up with each other, etc., but that essentially involved European countries carving up empires and creating hegemony throughout much of the known world. And they were also joined by the United States of America, which, though not a European country, created its own kind of individualized empire that you'll talk about next year and stuff like that. And while there are merits and drawbacks that can be argued ad nauseum, and there are probably significantly more drawbacks than merits, though let's not forget some of the merits about bringing technology and stuff like that in. It is undeniably clear that Europe has impacted pretty much every continent in a socioeconomic, cultural, and technological manner, and that's what the really overarching point behind imperialism and the impact of imperialism is the impact. I mean, almost every country speaks some version or has some secondary European language to it, culture, etc., because of the result of imperialism. And so that's essentially the end result of why imperialism matters, and what this short thing is going to kind of be arguing. Now, in order to understand imperialism, we need to first talk about empire. Okay, so as I just said, we need to talk about empire to understand imperialism, and I think people think empires are very simply just one thing, but they're not, because you can have different types of empires, and you can have empires that just involve soft power, and you can have empires of just influence and hegemony and stuff like that, right? So this was a definition put forward by Michael Doyle in his book Empires from about 30 years or so ago. And it argues that the empires are relationships of political control imposed by some political societies over the effective sovereignty of other political societies. They include more than just formally annexed territories, but they encompass less than the sum of all forms of international inequality. Imperialism is the process of establishing and maintaining an empire. All right, let's break this down, because that sounds complicated, but it's really not. Okay? Empires are relationships of political control imposed by some societies over the effective sovereignty of other societies. If you drop the political part of it, it makes complete sense. Empires are relationships of control imposed by some societies over the effective sovereignty of other societies. The political part just means people are involved. So in other words, they're relationships of control. okay? They include more than just formally annexed and conquered or conquered territories, stuff like that, okay? Because again, you can't have empires of hegemony. But they encompass less than the sum of all forms of international inequality. In other words, if one country that has very little to do with another country happens to be richer or stronger as a result of it, like in the international world, okay, that could be because of empire, but it's not always because of empire, right? So they don't include all the forms of international inequality, but they do include more than just conquest and conquering, and that's the key part. Okay, so there are things that, like, societies impose like one over the other. Okay, they include more than conquest and conquering, but they're not all the problems of international inequality. Okay, and then imperialism is the process of establishing and maintaining an empire. Or put it this way: imperialism is a seizure of one country by a stronger one for economic and political gains. As I've said multiple times, I would argue to you that industrialism plus nationalism equals imperialism. Okay, now before we get into the why part of this hardcore, I want to clarify one thing I've been saying, and joke that I'm making about guns, germs, and steel. But I also want to kind of clarify the overarching point behind what I'm saying with that and that joke. Once you get the steel, and once you get the guns, and once you get the germs, imperialism, societies are going to do that. That part I agree with entirely. My biggest thing is that I think he takes oversimplistic and slightly racist reasons for why it was that Europe got the guns, germs, and steel in the way they did, okay? But I do think that there's a very valid point that Jared Diamond is making in that like once they have the ability to imperialize and stuff like that, once they've had the industrialism and stuff like that, then like, sadly societies have generally chosen to subjugate each other rather than to like, lift up and make the world better. That's what we see throughout the vast majority of history, right? Okay, and so there are a number of reasons of why. First one that we go over is Europeans wanted raw material for the industries. They had a bunch of like factories and stuff where they were like building and making a bunch of stuff. But to be honest, like most of the European forests have been depleted at this point. They needed raw materials. They could go get those raw materials, or they could conquer and subjugate them, and then those raw materials would be imported that much easier and stuff like that, right? So like for example, you could go to Congo and get the rubber, or you could forcibly take the rubber and then make it and get even richer, right? So like they needed raw materials for their industries. That's the technology and industry part, right? They also wanted new markets for their goods, okay? After they'd made these things, after they'd taken the rubber and turned it into tires, they had more than enough ability to supply tires to everybody in Europe. But like, why stop at just Europe when you could actually like, expand to like, other parts of the world and like, make more money and progress and stuff, or quote unquote progress, more money and stuff that way. This is a natural part of capitalism that's become kind of the economic system of the world at this point, is to want to try to move forward and expand and stuff along those lines, and to continue to grow like the business, right? Speaking of expanding business, Europe had a massive population and technological boom. So like there was a natural move to want to expand before. There had been other population booms earlier in the 1100s, around the time of or sorry, even before that, 800s, sorry, around the time of the Vikings starting and stuff like that. Things had gotten warmer in Northern Europe, and so like there'd been more people, and they'd started to bump elbows, and that led to more exploration. Same type of thing happened during the Age of Exploration as well, after they got past the Black Death and stuff like that. And the same type of thing is happening here. Remember, like they've got more food so that people are living longer because they're healthier, and so like there's a natural move to expand for that. People who are not as wealthy find a natural way to move out and expand, and like try to like stake their own claim. Maybe some of the newer families or stuff like that, and like they kind of see that as like part of their movement and right within the world, if that makes sense. Like we've got enough people here, so let's move out. We're all bumping elbows, etc., etc., right? um we've got other new ideas that like led to the ability to expand, right? So like ideas like germ theory or evolution. which both led to like even stronger population growth, which led to like more people being able to like specialize and do it. Okay, we've got like 50 people with the ability to make shoes here. Let's go and expand to a different continent. I can bet you I can make a lot more shoes if I'm like the only person being able to do it there. Or they could also claim that they're kind of spreading the benefits of technology. And this was the other thing about like Europeans expanding, is they not only had like the population reasons to do it, they claimed to do it for like spreading like their natural ideas and benefits, etc., etc. Which leads us to our like most common reason for this, right? Which is ideas of racism, right? New theories on science, race, and evolution that we have gone over have said that white people were superior to other people, okay? This is why we talked about, like, the indoctrination and, like, that idea. And Darwin's ideas being applied to the races gives you ideas of social Darwinism, okay? Now, if you guys are unaware of what social Darwinism is, it's this idea of taking Darwin's ideas of, like, the strongest are there because they are the fittest and they are the genetically superior ones, etc., etc. That's why they've survived, and applying it to the world, and therefore looking at it and saying Northern Europeans are therefore the quote-unquote fittest. This is racism 101 right here. And therefore they are on top, and everybody else who's less evolved is less quote unquote fit, and therefore should not be like governing or ruling the world as much, or stuff like this. This is actually one of my single biggest pet peeves in the entire world. I hate social Darwinism with a passion. Now, having said that, these social Darwinists and racists would then extrapolate out and say, but oh, even though we're at the top, we really want to help these people, right? And they do say, so therefore we should expand and conquer them somewhat. We'll spread new ideas. This is what becomes known as white man's burden. It's seen as both a duty and a right, okay? We'll spread new ideas, we'll civilize them, etc., etc. I'm speaking with incredible amounts of sarcasm because this is not how it actually worked out. It worked in the ways of like subjugation and forced labor and slavery and stuff like this, but this is what was put forward. Okay, we're going to do things like conquer Asia and Africa in order to like make sure that like they become like reasonable, good, like active parts of like contributing like society, right? In other words, they become like as white as possible and become subjugated and work for the white people. But that's what was said and was put forward and stuff like that. And then finally, guys, there was a lot of competition with each other. Like rivalries between Britain and France and Germany lead to the colonization of Africa. Germany wants to make sure that France can't do anything. Britain wants to make sure Germany doesn't get too powerful. These big three end up fighting each other, etc., etc. And the end result of all of this is that like Africa and Asia were ripe targets for Europeans. Okay, the Americas would have been a very ripe target for Europeans as well. However, the United States has issued something called the Monroe Doctrine and then the Roosevelt Corollary. And basically what this said was that the Americas were closed for European expansion and stuff like this. Now, this was like not official international law in any way, but it meant that if the Europeans tried to do things to colonize in the Americas and stuff like that, the United States would generally get involved and generally get pissy. And by 1888, the United States is the largest economy in the world, and it's becoming a world power, and this is not something anybody overly wants to deal with. So like anything that's done in the Americas is generally done through neocolonialism rather than imperialism, which is like exploitation through influence and economic rather than like direct like conquest, if that makes sense, right? And by the way, that's what the Europeans originally planned to do. Like when they first got to India, they planned to just kind of exploit it through like economics and stuff like that, but it became significantly easier for the Europeans to like just flat out conquer, because then they didn't have to deal with any of the like random factors that might come up or any of the like problems of people complaining or stuff like that. And that's where we got to the idea of imperialism. As I was just saying, very few 19th century empires begin with like direct rule, okay? Most of these things start with some type of like soft power, cultural power, like trade, etc., and then they migrate to hard power. So like, as I mentioned, like in Egypt or India or something like that, like, in Egypt, the British need cotton because they've lost like, cotton from the Americas, and so they're going to eventually start trading there, and then they realize, hey, it'll be a lot easier if we just conquer it, right? Like, or sometimes it's over a rivalry, like, the British, for example, wanted to kick the French out of India, which is part of the reason they started. The French were actually there first, although they don't get credit for it because Britain became so much more famous for its exploitation of India. But the French were actually there first, and the British wanted to kick the French out so that they could basically be able to like economically exploit it, et cetera, et cetera. And so like they ended up like starting the conquest of it like somewhat that way. They also started the conquest via like distribution. So basically, my point is that this thing generally starts as soft power and then leads to some type of hard power, okay, or conquest or something like that. You see actually the same thing with the United States and Hawaii. Okay, it starts with like economic power and then soft power and then moves to like direct control, conquest, and then eventually statehood, which you could debate is direct or indirect imperialism, hard or soft power. You'd have to talk to more Native Hawaiians or U.S. history teachers who've read a ton more about that than I can, or than I have to get into that. But the point is that like that idea is fairly common. And to be honest, guys, you also then see like a migration back to soft power and back to hegemony after the colony or the empire has been given up, right? And you see that even in stuff today, like natural ties between the United States and Great Britain, because we both happen to speak English. Or like same type of thing between if there tends to be a problem in Algeria or something like that, people tend to look to France to take the lead since France was its colony and they still speak French and stuff along those lines, right? And once a country has established some type of like power over each other, they're said to have hegemony. Now we talked about this earlier with uh, um, what was I going to say? With Spain and Spanish colonial absolutism and stuff along those lines when we we're defining it. But I just want to remind you of this. This is like influence that like one country has over an area, region, et cetera, right? Okay, this is what like gives the United States so much soft power today is the number of places that they have like hegemony from like cultural power to like flat out Air Force bases, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing that like empires in Europe tried to do was kind of establish this over and over and over again. Okay, and they're gonna do this by, as I said, using a mixture of hard and soft power, and also trying to build up big navies. Okay, at the turn of the 20th century, there is this book that is published that argues it's called "The Influence of Sea Power Upon History" by Commodore Alfred Thayer Mahan. And it argues that like whoever has had the largest navy has been the like strongest country throughout history, and at that point it's Britain. And but if you look back in history, that's true, and if you look forward in history, that's kind of true. And so this argues that if you build up islands to serve as bases, you build influence all throughout the world, then that's going to lead to like power and the ability for countries to be able to kind of like rule and control the world and stuff along those lines, right? And so we see, empires go from like empires of like you see like different types of empires going from like direct hard empires in the like 19th century to like more modern empires, which are more empires of hegemony, rather than empires of conquest and stuff along those lines. Okay, but all these makes up the idea of imperialism empire, and we're going to see this, and we're going to see imperialism and hegemony in some form of it all the way through the rest of this class, okay? Even once we've gotten through direct imperialism like this, right, then we'll get to stuff like the Cold War, where the United States has hegemony over one half of the world and the Soviet Union has hegemony over the other half of the world, okay? Last thing I wanted to show you guys was a chart that gives you kind of types of imperialism here, okay? And there are four main types that kind of historians have identified, okay? You have colonies, which are very direct imperialism, like, Somaliland was in East Africa, was a French colony, okay? You have protectorates in which, countries might say, like, I'm gonna, like, quote-unquote, give you, the ability to rule yourself, but establish military control and internal government and an outside power and stuff like that. Various mandates, like the British Mandate for Palestine or protectorates over Nigerian Delta back in the day, were fairly common. You have ideas of spheres of influence, and these are countries, as I said, that once you've had some type of political hegemony established, it usually stays there for an extended period of time, right? Exclusive like trading privileges or agreements or stuff along those lines. Liberia is the perfect example. This was a place in Africa that the United States allowed former slaves to go back and resettle, and so there have always kind of been like ties between like the Liberia and the United States and stuff like that. Their capital is even named Monrovia after James Monroe, et cetera, et cetera. And then you also get economic imperialism, which we've talked about, which is can lead directly to hard imperialism, as it did with like the Dole Fruit Company in Hawaii and stuff like that. But it can also just be like economic and business interests, like kind of taking over and taking control of like countries and their relationship. And that's what Doyle was saying at the beginning when he said, like, this includes more than like just formally annexed territories, but encompass less than the sum of all international inequality, right? All these are like ideas of like, of influence and how like nations get influence over each other. And so this is basically kind of where we leave it. You can see that Europe has become a like, a place of big countries and empire for the most part. I mean, Austria-Hungary is huge, sitting in the center of Europe right here. The Russian Empire makes up all of this. Poland, which is right there, is technically not a country even anymore. I mean, it's part of Austria. Sorry, not Austria. It's part of Russia. Same with like large parts of Austria-Hungary have like, Hungary in it, obviously, but then what would be Czech Republic and Slovakia, Slovenia, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, like, these guys have like, the primate states of Europe have decided, like, their power, their influence, their dominance, and they're getting larger and larger. And they're also building up their military, which is going to lead to, like, the perfect storm at the beginning of the 20th century. All right, that's all I got for today. Hopefully this gives you kind of a broad overview of empire and imperialism and stuff like that. I will talk to you guys soon when we start World War I. Later.